All that is great we owe to neurotics. They, and no others, have founded religions, created masterpieces. The world will never know how much we owe them, and especially how much they suffered to give all of this to the world. We glory in their divine music, their beautiful paintings, and thousands of subtleties, without realizing the innumerable sleepless nights, tears, spasmodic laughters, urticaria, asthma, and, worst of all, fear of death they cost those who created them. The idea of a link between madness and creativity has existed since at least the ancient Greeks, with a tortured artist archetype being applied to a variety of artists and intellectual figures throughout history who suffered from real or perceived mental illness while still creating works of substantial value, either in spite of or because of said illnesses or trauma. In this video, I'll be taking a look at the tortured artist trope and why it exists. I'm also going to be talking about some of the science between mental illness and creativity that I found interesting, as well as why most tortured artists are romanticized most heavily after their deaths, and of course the controversies around this topic in general. And with that, I think we should start with talking about the science between creativity and mental illness. And to begin with, there have been large-scale studies showing correlations between creative occupations and mental illnesses, with higher rates of anxiety and bipolar disorders, schizophrenia and substance abuse, and higher rates of suicide, depending on the art form. There have also been studies showing that among people with relatives who have mental illness, particularly schizophrenia, there is overrepresentation in creative professions, even among undiagnosed siblings of those affected. And when it comes to unipolar depression, there's conflicting research, some showing correlations particularly among writers, and some showing no significant correlation whatsoever. When it comes to more specific examples, however, of how creativity and traits associated with mental illness are linked, I want to take a look at some studies on latent inhibition and creative achievement, as well as how mood states alter the way that we think, and how this is related to creative output. I pronounce latent wrong throughout this section. I at least fixed the voiceovers, but if mispronunciation is your pet peeve, I apologize. And to explain what latent inhibition is, it's basically the subconscious method that your brain uses to block out familiar stimuli, so that way you're not constantly overwhelmed in your senses by everything going on around you. For example, if you're going to the park, you might notice birds chirping outside and children making noise when you step out of your car and walk in, but eventually you're able to mostly tune out those stimuli so you can focus on reading your book or talking to your friend or whatever it is that you're doing. You're still hearing the noises, but it's really in the back of your mind. It's not really there. Or to use a more basic example, your room is full of familiar sights and sounds and visual stimuli. You're not constantly thinking about what everything looks like when you're sitting alone in your room. Because it's familiar to you, your brain knows to block out that unnecessary information, so you're not constantly overwhelmed and debilitated by everything going on around you. But if your latent inhibition were to be low enough, every time you walk in your room, you essentially would be treating it as if it's a brand new room. All of that familiar stimuli is still hitting your brain as if it's new. It makes it harder, or at least take longer, for your brain to make connections and associations between things. And it's going to be harder for you to do any kind of regular task without being distracted, because there's just too much information hitting you. Everyone experiences latent inhibition to varying degrees, but when it comes to low latent inhibition, this is oftentimes seen in people prone to psychotic states or people with other forms of mental illness. For example, during the beginning stages of schizophrenia, the latent inhibition in someone's brain dissipates, causing them to experience psychosis and overwhelm due to an inability to filter out familiar stimuli. You can also see how having a naturally lower level of latent inhibition can be associated with ADHD, where unimportant and familiar stimuli can be distracting and overwhelming to those with this condition compared to those without it. Because low latent inhibition makes it take longer to make connections between things in the classical conditioning sense, this can also help account for why some people who are seen as slow are actually really good learners. It just takes them a little while longer, but once they know something, they know it, and they may be more creative in their methods at arriving at their conclusions. Outside of pathological states and classical conditioning, however, low latent inhibition has been increasingly studied in the context of creativity from the late 20th to early 21st centuries, with studies showing substantial evidence that when paired with moderating factors such as high IQ or trait openness to experience, low latent inhibition can aid creative achievement and divergent thinking in individuals compared with those with higher levels of latent inhibition. To quote from some of the studies I linked, these moderating factors may allow an individual to override a deficit in early selective attentional processing with a high-functioning mechanism at a later, more controlled level of selective processing. The highly creative individual may be privileged to access a greater inventory of unfiltered stimuli during early processing, thereby increasing the odds of original recombinant ideation. Thus, a deficit that is generally associated with pathology may well impart a creative advantage in the presence of other cognitive strengths such as high IQ. As stated earlier, there are traits independent of IQ that also can influence creative achievement in people with low latent inhibition, but to use what I just talked about in kind of a very solidified extreme example, I think would be to talk about the mathematician John Nash, who had both schizophrenia and an obviously superior intelligence. While not an artist himself, he did use extensive creative thinking and pattern recognition in his work to come up with the Nash equilibrium, later winning the Nobel Prize for his contributions to game theory. In an interview talking about his illness, he stated, "Some decisions might not have been the most rational. Times I didn't follow the norm, thought differently. But I can see there's a connection between not following normal thinking and doing creative thinking. I wouldn't have had good scientific ideas if I had thought more normally. One could be very successful in life and be very normal. But if you're Van Gogh or artists like that, you may be a little off." While it would be impossible to measure how much, if at all, of John's success was enhanced by the traits that left him prone to psychosis and schizophrenia, it certainly seems possible for there to be a link based on what we know. And obviously there were decades in which John was crippled by his illness and unable to get work done, and schizophrenia is a disease I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. But I'll talk more about the problems people have with this idea of the tortured artist or genius later on in the video, as well as why people romanticize figures like this. But low latent inhibition aside, I do want to talk about the different mood states that people find themselves in the context of creative thinking and production, and how it relates to notions of mental illness. People have long made comparisons between creative work and illnesses such as bipolar disorder, in that artists often have bursts of working for insanely long hours on projects both preceded and followed by periods of depression. And while some artists certainly do have bipolar disorder, I want to talk about more generally why this happens in the general creative population. Literally, if you want to know what I watch on YouTube, I watch people who are in art school doing vlogs, like weekly vlogs, because I love seeing someone paint something and be like, yeah, I spent 36 hours on this, I haven't slept in like 3 days, and spending like 6 hours finding the perfect shade of red for their portrait. I'm like, yes, like seeing you be crazy and stressed makes me calm. But whether or not creative people have this to a pathological degree, I do want to talk about these sort of mood states that people engage in during creative projects more generally. And that comes down to a mix of divergent and convergent thinking. If you look at the whole brain theory of creativity, I'm pretty sure there's something like that. It's the ability for your right brain and left brain to work in somewhat harmony. When it comes to problem solving or artistic creation, divergent thinking is creatively coming up with multiple solutions to a problem, whereas convergent thinking is narrowing down and using logical inference to deduce said solutions to the problem, like getting rid of the extraneous stuff. And to use an example of how we all engage in both divergent and convergent thinking, you can think about it as if you have an essay due next week where you analyze 2 books against each other, and for the sake of the example, we're going to pretend like you actually read the books. You might spend the first week just kind of thinking in your head about what kind of arguments you might like to make, what potential positions there are out there, making little connections and so on, some of it tangential and unrelated, some of it kind of more related. You're basically going about your day, but kind of thinking about how you're going to solve this problem. But then time passes and you realize that the paper is due tomorrow, and all of a sudden you're going into convergent thinking because your dopamine levels are obviously going down. You narrow down on all that extraneous thinking. You're like, all right, that argument's stupid, that makes no sense, no, that doesn't work. We need to figure out what works, expend as little energy as possible doing so, and then become super analytical and check over, make sure everything's good, and cutting out all of the fluff. Like, that's convergent thinking. And so while the brainstorming part of the project is the most creative and fun, the convergent thinking is how you actually get it over with and make sure it's at least decent before you turn it in. And this pattern of thinking is associated with mood. The more dopamine you have, the more likely you are to engage in divergent thinking, whereas when you experience lower dopamine, you're more likely to use your analytical brain and use convergent thinking. As it relates to art, most creative impulse and activity comes when you're coming out of a depressive episode, not when you're in one, but some levels of lower mood can help you to fine-tune material according to this idea. In relation to bipolar 2 disorder, it's said that hypomania can also boost your creative output because of the increase in self-confidence that occurs when you're going through an episode like that. And so whether or not you have this sort of cycle and pathological levels as an actual disordered, or if you engage in a similar cycle with your own sort of creative production and output, these sort of mood cycles could be helpful for some people who experience this while totally debilitating for others. It all just kind of depends on various factors. And so when it comes to the tortured artist trope, I think this can help us understand why people associate bipolar with that sort of stock character. But scientific theories aside, I do want to get into the controversial nature of this topic and trope and why so many people have so many different issues with it. So the main reason why this trope is seen as problematic is that people feel like it romanticizes mental illness by ignoring the real struggles mentally ill artists are facing. And I'll touch more on this later, but I've also talked at length about this in my last video. People also find the trope problematic in that they think it asserts that mental illness is a requirement for creative achievement when it's not. There's also the fear that this trope and its representations will cause mentally ill people to forego getting help because they'll associate creativity with their mental illness. And you can get into an entire conversation about medical ethics here, about forced medicalization and straitjackets and the right to die movement and like all this kind of stuff, like how much autonomy we should grant people who are mentally ill. If a schizophrenic person is going through an episode and refuses to take their medication, should you be allowed to force that on them? Like, that's a whole conversation I'm not even going to get into, but the surface level criticism is that it will convince people not to get help. But one quote I've seen people bring up in this conversation, because all we do in the 21st century is dig up dead people's quotes and deem them to be problematic, is the painter Edvard Munch, who painted The Scream, where he said, "My troubles are a part of me and my art. They are indistinguishable from me, and it would destroy my art. I want to keep those sufferings." And I've certainly met countless people who feel that antidepressants or antipsychotics have made them feel like zombies or not themselves or uncreative, and this is a real phenomenon that people deal with. In a similar vein to this, ethical considerations of the tortured artist trope did lead to scene changes in A Beautiful Mind around medication, so as not to lead schizophrenic people to believe that they too can quote-unquote fix their schizophrenia through sheer force of will without medication, even though John Nash himself was able to eventually get a grip on his illness without the use of antipsychotics. And while I don't think that the producers and directors of this movie are under any moral obligation to lie about John Nash's life to potentially help other people with the same condition, I also think it's well within their right to do so if that's what they want. They left out a lot about John Nash's life, like the fact he had an illegitimate baby with his nurse, that he had homosexual experiences and was like arrested and fired for indecent exposure. Like, they left a lot out of this movie. They also made it seem like he was with his wife the whole time, like they weren't divorced for 3 decades, I think. But that's the creative liberties of a biopic. I'm not here to judge it. I'm just saying that considerations of the tortured artist trope have played a role in how mental illness is represented on screen. Medical stuff aside, however, there are also people who believe that this trope ignores the economic conditions that artists find themselves in that cause them to, for instance, take their own life. Artists are oftentimes very poor, obviously, and not making a lot of money off of their work. But I will say that poverty tends to amplify the issues that you're facing, and it is true that economic stressors can push an already vulnerable person over the edge. But there are also plenty of examples throughout history of mentally ill artists making great amounts of wealth and still suffering, including Edvard Munch, who I brought up earlier. Something else that people bring up in regards to this topic that I also find kind of strange is the retroactively diagnosing people from the past with mental illnesses. Like, I understand using present knowledge to make sense of the past and so on, but it's also just, I find it very strange. I listened to an interview a while back on the Friends of Vic Chestnut after he committed suicide, where the interviewer asks if they think his mania helped him to stay up all night writing songs, and the friend was like, "I wouldn't put a pathology on his creativity." And I just really like that. It kind of struck my heart a little bit. Because while labels and diagnoses and all of that can be helpful, there is an element of where that kind of just takes away the humanity of this person, like, oh, we could just explain them away with some kind of disorder. And there's just a lot of weird stuff that comes with that, but I'm going to be making upcoming videos both on the over-pathologization of normal human variation as like mental illness, as well as our obsessions with labels, and also what's going on in the weird world of like self-diagnosis online. There's so much to talk about, and I might even do like a whole history of like the anti-psychiatry movement and other sorts of movements within psychology. So I'm not going to get into the whole labeling, diagnoses, that whole conversation here, but I will talk about it more in upcoming videos, so subscribe if you're interested, I guess. Vic Chestnut has also talked before about how while he liked to play guitar before his accident, when he became a paraplegic at 18, he felt like he finally had something to write about, furthering the notion that an individual's suffering can be made into great art. But to end the controversy section, I want to read this comment that I came across online. I can't remember where I saw it. I just wrote it down when I saw it because it really describes how I feel about this topic. And it says, Bourdain, Robin Williams, David Foster Wallace. When you're in pain or the throes of depression, nothing else matters. Fame, a good life, love, money, none of it. And I wish we could talk about these kinds of things more without the automatic accusation that when you talk about a depressed person who happens to be brilliant, you're romanticizing mental illness. And so with all of those controversies aside, I want to get into the reasons why people like this trope, like why they like it so much, and why it's been a part of history for so long. Humans are naturally storytelling creatures, and we consequently also seem to have a natural tendency to typify people in both fiction and real life. Whether through Hippocrates' personality types, Carl Jung's archetypes, Big Five personality tests, or even zodiac signs, we like seeing repeating tropes of characters throughout historical narratives. In a way, it helps us to understand ourselves and those around us better, though all tropes have their limitations and some tropes have more validity than others. I've explored some of the reasons why people romanticize mental illness in art in a previous video, and a lot of those reasons apply here as well, so I won't spend too much time on it, but I think one of the biggest reasons people empathize with and appreciate the tortured artist is their individualistic nature. Both artists and people who deviate from the norm, for instance due to mental illness, seem to follow an internal compass that is perceived to be largely uninfluenced by the societal norms around them. When it comes to the eccentric nature of creative types, John Stuart Mill wrote that the amount of eccentricity in a society has generally been proportional to the amount of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage which it contained, and mourned a lack of eccentricity as the chief danger of the time. There is also an inherent mystery to both mental illness and creativity because they aren't something we really know too deeply about. And when it comes to repeating patterns of particular kinds of artists succumbing to their madness, the curiosity of whether or not these patterns are coincidental or causational gets piqued. The tortured artist trope exists also because these people exist in every generation. We always get a new batch of tortured souls who happen to make really good art. I don't know, it just happens. The trope also continues to exist because most people who have ever hung out around creative people can kind of just see with their own two eyes. They just happen to have more neurotic traits than a lot of other types of people. It's just kind of something you can observe in your regular life. And this is not just something that exists among artists. I mean, there's also like higher instances of autism and families with people who have a lot of STEM field people in their family, like engineers and so on. Similar to low latent inhibition, factors that may be a disability in some could also provide an advantage when mixed with other favorable genetic factors. But again, it just varies so much on the individual. The tortured artist trope is also inspirational because the sad truth is that if you hang out with a lot of creative and mentally ill people, you see a lot of great minds die due to mental illness, addiction, and suicide. And with the latter, all future potential creative works are lost too. Most people are unable to remain prolific despite mental illness, and so when it comes to people who are able to do this, and even better yet, get recognized, they can serve as a beacon of light for others struggling, even when their lives meet tragic ends. It's always inspiring to see a creative person get recognition. But overall, I think the feeling towards tortured artists throughout history is gratitude. I know so many people who act like they knew Vincent Van Gogh personally. They're like, yeah, like I understand Vincent so much. Okay. But people feel gratitude towards figures like that because they were fully themselves and society didn't get it, and people sometimes identify with that. I also think a reason this trope exists is because it almost seems like creativity in and of itself is a pathology, and this is where I'm going to get accused of romanticizing mental illness. But the art making process is one of those few activities that's run pretty much solely by passion, and there's a reason why passion and suffering have been linked throughout the centuries, which is that you are literally sacrificing yourself for this thing that is greater than you that other people might not even like. And when it comes to the artistic process as well, the path is the same whether or not you make it. Like, you're still creating throughout your life. Some people might recognize it, some people might not, but you literally don't know either until it happens to you or until you're dead.
But I went through my own version of it. I've been doing this for 38 years, and I didn't get big till I'd been doing it for like 25. Well, that's how long it took me. So I'm not talking from, I'm not like a guy who exploded after 5 years and then I'm like, yeah, you guys don't need this stuff. I mean, I did it the hard way.
Right.
And that road, that 25-year road was, to me, it's the only road to really being a great comic. It's also the same road to shit, to nothing.
Right.
Because it takes 25 years to find out
that
you never should have started. It's the same road. It's a rough fucking life.
But that's why it's so important to intrinsically love what you're doing, which feeding back into it is exactly why it's a passion project and why we recognize it as such. You have to intrinsically enjoy what you're doing throughout your lifetime, whether or not you ever get recognition or validation. And if you're doing something that goes against your own spirit, all the money in the world might not make you happy. We see that over and over and over again. There are also, of course, countless artists who make art out of their suffering. They experience horrendous things, and that shows itself through their art, and we all get to benefit from it, all the pain that they went through. There's just a lot of reasons why the tortured artist trope exists. But with that being said, I do want to talk about how when it comes to this trope, most tortured artists are romanticized most heavily after their deaths and not so much before. While a lot of tortured artists achieve fame and wealth throughout their time on this earth, maybe even more so than the ones who only gain recognition after death, there is a curious trend of people romanticizing figures after death to a much larger degree than when they were alive. And to propose one very simple reason for this, it's because dealing with mentally ill people while they're alive can be extraordinarily difficult. And if you don't believe me, I have 2 words for you. Kanye West. Like, I love that guy's music, at least up to Life of Pablo, but he is crazy. Like, do you remember when we all thought he was gonna murder Pete Davidson? I thought we were gonna have an OJ part 2, but instead of the Kardashians defending the killer, they'd be on the opposite side. Like, that was a crazy time. And now all of us Kanye fans have to literally, like, put disclaimers anytime we talk about him, being like, I do not support anti-Semitism or comments about Hitler or anything else that Kanye's done or said in recent interviews. I just like his music. And naturally as well, a lot of people have turned on him, but this is what I mean when I say, in real time, mental illness is not always pretty. Even Vincent Van Gogh's brother, who loved him more than any person's ever loved another human being ever, had to cut him off financially when he started fucking this like really dirty hooker with syphilis and alcoholism and a bunch of kids with a bunch of different people who probably smelled bad and like barked at people. His brother was like, I'm not giving you money until you dump her. Like, this is the last straw for me. I can't take this, Vincent. And he was like, no, I love her. Like, I will make the world see her as I see her. And he like went to the hospital with gonorrhea and shit. Like, that was also a time and a half. I mean, Van Gogh, he's kind of the worst of all. I mean, I talk about him a lot in this video because I truly think he's what most people think of when they think of the tortured artist. But he also literally got locked up in a hospital at one time because the townspeople made a petition saying he was a public danger. Like, this guy is certifiably crazy. He's like eating paint, talking to people who aren't there. He cuts off his own ear and gives it to a prostitute. Like, can you imagine just being at work being like, oh fuck, how many guys am I gonna have to fuck today? I really wish I could just go home. I'm like not feeling it. And a guy stumbles in with blood spurting out the side of his face, handing you his ear and saying, take good care of this. Like, what would you even do in that situation? Is this something that these brothel prostitutes see often? Like, it's just, yeah, certifiably crazy. Like, it's true his fame happened after his death because his brother's wife was like really good at marketing and stuff and published all his letters to Theo and people like to get to know him as a person. That romanticization though can only really happen about someone who you either don't know personally or who has already passed when that is their behavior, just like point blank. Now we get to look at him as misunderstood and a genius, and of course his artworks are amazing and beautiful and so on, but it's like, back in the day, bro, people dealing with him on a day-to-day basis, I just think things were different for them. Like, that's all I'm saying. And this is a hot take about artists that I've always had, which is that I think that they just kind of intrinsically follow a different moral compass from other people, which might sound really bad because I feel like the best artists just push the boundaries. They push the moral boundaries of the time period. They get people to think about something in a different way. They cause you to experience emotions that you would otherwise suppress. Like, a lot's going on there. I'm not saying I think artists get a free pass to like rape as many people as they want. Like, please don't take it like that because I know people love to take things to extremes. But I do think artists do push moral boundaries a lot of the times through their work and sometimes also through their life. And when it comes to this moral compass and the fact that they're fueled by something inside of them, not by moral norms or societal expectations, this individualistic aspect, I think this is also a huge reason why people romanticize people after their death. If you think about that book, Into the Wild, Christopher McCandless and everything, like, people romanticize that book so much and they're like, wow, I wish I could quit my job and burn my money and go into the woods and live alone and live deliberately and suck the marrow out of life and all of that romantic shit. When it's like, this guy died starving, overdosed on poisonous berries, alone, wishing he had a friend. Like, it wasn't really cool for him. But people are always going to perceive things how they want to perceive it, even if it's actually a tragedy. But the point is, you can't control other people's perceptions of anything you do or any art that you create because it's also subjective, and people just kind of take what they want from what's going on and just leave out the rest. But even when it comes to artists who are popular in their time, some of their best works go unrecognized or unrealized until long after they're dead, even if they otherwise had a fruitful career. If you think about Picasso's Blue Period, I mean, it's the main thing people I think of when they think of Picasso. That was extremely unpopular at the time. Like, he was just going through depression using one color to paint things. Like he became very poor and broke during this time. But it's like, when someone dies, you have their entire life's work to look at, and sometimes periods that when you're living through are not good actually are kind of good after some time has passed. Like, that happens a lot. And these days I've seen this effect happen a lot in the opposite direction as well. People criticizing artists who used to make sad music for making happier music instead. They're like, you were better before you went to rehab, like shit like that. And that just applies to the same thing about Picasso. Like, people go through different periods in their life, and the music is going to reflect that. Depending on what state you're in is kind of going to guide what artwork that you consume. And so maybe, yeah, you did like an artist better before they got better. But the cool thing about art is that it exists forever. So you could just enjoy it over and over again and hopefully find another depressed heroin addict to listen to if that's still what you're doing for the next few years. To conclude, I don't think you need to be mentally ill to create good art, and in more cases than not, mental illness probably hinders creation more so than aids it. An archetype or trope, by definition, is a stereotype or generalization about a certain kind of person, and isn't meant to be taken as some detailed hard proof about life and humanity. That being said, I think there is likely some validity to the basis of the trope, regardless of heated perceptions around it. For as long as both suffering and artists exist, there will be suffering represented through art and art born out of suffering. While I understand criticisms of the trope, I don't think writing the whole thing off as problematic is going to change either the basis of the trope or the fact that tortured artists will always exist, and that people will always pick up on these patterns, regardless of whether they apply to the majority of creatives or not. But let me know what you all think down below, and sorry if I got a little unhinged towards the end there, hence the voiceover conclusion. If you're subscribed to me, I'll see you in the next video, and if not, thank you for watching anyway, and goodbye.